This is our last Sidore lecture series, so I'd like to thank the Humanities Center for sponsoring this. It's our last lecture on the theme of who's a person now. This is our honors symposium, and today our speaker is Professor Lori Gruen of Wesleyan University. She's the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan, and she's also a professor of feminist, gender, and sexuality studies, and is the coordinator of Wesleyan Animal Studies. She is the author and editor of 9 books, including Ethics in Animals, an introduction, The Ethics of Captivity, and Entangled Empathy. Her work in practical ethics focuses on issues that impact those often overlooked in traditional ethical investigations. For example, women, people of color, prisoners, and non-human animals. She's a fellow of the Hastings Center for Bioethics, a faculty fellow at Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, Center for Animals and Public Policy, and she was the first chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee of the Center for Prison Education at Wesleyan. And Professor Gruen has a long-standing interest in chimpanzees and has documented the history of the first 100 chimpanzees in research in the United States. So I would like you all to welcome Professor Gruen.
Hi, I'm happy to be here as the last lecturer in the Sidore lecture series. It's both an honor and also a bit daunting because I'm the kind of person who's like, oh, I'm supposed to answer this question. I'm the last lecturer. I need to answer the question, who's a person now or who's a human now? You'll see that I changed the I think somebody else changed the title of their talk. Maybe Professor Livingston Smith did too. But I'm interested in thinking about and rethinking, actually, what it means to be human and whether we need to even answer the question. And so that's what I'm going to be arguing about. But I'll say a little bit about the way I'm going to be using, in this particular discussion, human and person sort of interchangeably. Although there are reasons for thinking that that might not be a good idea as well. So what I'm going to argue is that perhaps instead of asking who's human now, we might ask how to reframe that question and imagine what it would mean to reject the very idea of the human. So that's going to be what I want us to be thinking about today. Human, as you guys have been discussing over the course of this year, I guess it's been a whole year, is a category that changes over time. And this is of central importance in thinking about inclusions and exclusions and about just how categorical the concept of human or person is. The idea of the human generally tends to be thought of as a biological category, but I want to talk about the human or the person as a political category. We can use human and person, as I just mentioned, interchangeably, and in part that helps us to really frame the political nature of the concept. And so what I'm interested in focusing on is particularly the political nature of when and how attributions of the human or the person are made. And by political nature, this is kind of right in my eye, so I'm going to push this down a little bit. By political nature, I mean the social power that attends to the attributions of what's at stake when one is deemed human or not deemed human. I'm particularly interested in how the invocation of the binary between the human and the non-human, or the person and the non-person, is used to uphold a certain kind of social relations between those who matter, who are part of a community of agents and actors, and those that don't matter, or matter only insofar as they're useful for upholding the binary for those who matter. Okay, so I want to start by presenting 2 cases, but before I get there, I do need to introduce you to the chimpanzee behind me. Her name is Sheba. I'll return to her in a bit. Has anybody here heard of Nim Chimpsky? Raise your hand if you've heard of Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky was the subject of a documentary not that long ago, and also a book by Betsy Hess, Elizabeth Hess, of the same name. And Nim Chimpsky is a play on Noam Chomsky, Nim was someone who was first taught sign language. Sheba, who's behind me, is Nim Chimpsky's daughter. She's not been taught sign language, but she's extraordinarily communicative, and she's a chimpanzee that I've known for a little while. Okay, I'm going to present two cases. I'll return to Sheba in a second. But I'm going to present two cases, and I want to just mention that there's a little bit, I need to mention a content warning. Not the next slide, but the slide after has dead animals. So if that bothers you, it's not really grotesque or anything, but the story is sort of grotesque, but you might want to turn away. Okay, so this is Marius, a 2-year-old giraffe who was shot in the head by the administrators of the Copenhagen Zoo in February of 2014. Has anybody heard of that? Marius, yeah. What happened next, and this is a little bloody, is they performed a public autopsy on his body and fed Marius's body parts to the lions that were held captive at the zoo. Both the autopsy and the feeding were done in view of zoo-goers, and you can see there's actually parents and children parents with their children watching. And it was, I guess, something like kind of an educational spectacle of a sort. But we might want to ask, what were they being educated about? And I think that's an important question. I'm going to I want you to keep that question in mind as I go through, because I'll return to the question later. I also want to just note that a bit more privately, the same zoo killed the lions that ate Marius's body a month or so later to make room for more genetically worthy captives. And the zoo's justification for killing Marius was that he had genes that were already well represented in the captive giraffe population in Europe. Remember, it's Copenhagen. The justification for killing the lions was that the zoo was planning to introduce a younger male who was not genetically related to any of the females in the group. So what was going on in the case of killing Marius, feeding Marius to the lions, and then killing the lions that ate Marius was all justified in the name of a kind of genetic purity or a genetic diversity of a certain sort in the context of the zoo. Okay, the second case I want to mention is that of Samuel Debose. After being pulled over for failure to display a front license plate by a University of Cincinnati cop on July 19th in 2015, Mr. Debose, a 43-year-old unarmed father of many kids, was shot point blank in the head and killed. Ray Tensing, the offending officer, lied to the police dispatch about what had happened, and the university delayed the release of the video, which was recorded because he had a body cam on, because they knew that there would be protests. And they were right to worry. The video is chilling. As New York Times columnist Charles Blow wrote, to watch that video is to be witness to an execution. What kind of person takes another person's life so cavalierly? Now, demands for legal response often follow revelations of grotesque disregard for the lives of others. But in these cases, as we've seen in too many cases, justice is not served by the courts in societies where violence against Black bodies and the slaughter of animals are normalized parts of everyday practices. There are at least two ways of approaching the inadequacy of the law to address this violent disregard. One is to work towards greater inclusion within the law. And that's a very familiar way in which we work towards thinking about how to try to make some difference about this violent disregard. The other is to more deeply examine the conceptual reasons for the inadequacies of the law in the first place. And I know you all were here or many of you, most of you were here for the last lecture where you heard about the work of the Nonhuman Rights Project, filing writs of habeas corpus on behalf of chimpanzees in New York State. This is a great example of a common way of approaching the exclusionary inadequacies of the law, that first way I was mentioning. What Steve Wise, who was here speaking, was inspired by was the legal reasoning in the highly studied and variably interpreted case Somerset versus Stewart that was a a 1772 decision in which James Somerset, a man captured in Africa and sold to Charles Stuart in Boston, accompanied him to England where he escaped. When he was recaptured, Somerset was forced onto a ship headed for a slave plantation in Jamaica, and anti-slave campaigners secured legal representation for Somerset and filed a habeas corpus writ, much like Steve Wise has done for chimpanzees, although in the 1772 case, Somerset's writ was granted and his freedom secured. That hasn't happened with chimpanzees. Now, what the Non-Human Rights Project saw an analogy with the slave cases, and we're seeking to establish what you heard, legal personhood for the chimpanzees and possibly other animals to protect their rights to bodily integrity and liberty and allow them to seek remedy through their proxies when those rights are violated. I do want to just so what I'm talking about is sort of this analogical thinking that kind of puts the case of animals and the case of slaves or the case of black bodies in conjunction with one another. And so before I say more about that, which will be what I'm doing in this talk, I need to say that this is a dangerous way of proceeding. And so I just want to highlight that particular kind of danger, seeing blacks as non-humans, or more precisely, not seeing black people as human, and comparing them to animals has, of course, been one of the ways that anti-black racism has perpetuated itself, rendering black people as beings who aren't humans or aren't persons. It's one of the central ways that black people are dehumanized, as in a lecture you heard, was it last semester? Maybe last semester? This semester, okay. So it's one of the ways that black people are dehumanized. But the meaning of these comparisons, so there's danger here, and I'll say a little bit more about that danger, but the meaning of these comparisons is precisely what's at stake. And so I'll cautiously tread, and have been cautiously treading into this dangerous territory. Part of the reason that I have been thinking about these things together is not because I actually think that it is necessarily, that these cases are necessarily analogous, but part of the reason is because I think that by looking at the parallels, we can observe some sort of common features that help us to understand what's problematic about the very concept of the human. So that's what I want to say. I also want to note now, so that's one aside. Second aside, I've been teaching in prison for about a decade now. In the last 8 years, I've been teaching in a particular maximum security men's prison. I've been teaching philosophy, political philosophy, environmental philosophy there. And one of the things that happened was I thought for a really long time that I would just teach philosophy and I wouldn't talk about the animal work that I do. And I've been doing animal studies work and animal ethics work for a very long time, thinking that the men that I taught wouldn't really know that that's also what I do, that I teach in prisons and I work in political philosophy and that I work in ethics and I work in animal ethics in particular. And so I was actually quite nervous about them knowing that, worried about the stereotypes that we all know are a problem. And it turns out, so in a maximum security prison in Connecticut, you don't have access to the internet. So obviously, if you Google me, you will know that I work on animals. So, but they can't Google me. So I thought, okay, after a few years' time, I'm going to let them know that I also do this animal work, and I was kind of nervous about how they would react to that. But so when I finally got over being fairly timid about it and told them, I was really embarrassed to find out that they already knew. And they didn't mind, and they didn't find it offensive, and they didn't find it problematic, and they understood what I was, what I saw as being important. They didn't think I was comparing them to captive animals. And so it went really well. But I think it went really well because of the mutual respect we've developed. And I was really greatly relieved. I think it's important to be really careful in doing this kind of analysis to just highlight out and make clear that there are significant dangers in this territory. Okay. So that's a little bit about my personal interest and also just a general warning about these dangers. But back to this, the case that you heard about in the last lecture. In filing the habeas writs, the Non-Human Rights Project was seeking to recategorize non-human animals from the property status under the law to persons. And they're making extensionist arguments to extend the boundaries of the category of the legal person to include more beings. Now, historically in the United States and in Europe, for example, we've seen that white Christian men at the center extending rights to non-Christian men and then non-white men and then women and then maybe some others. And since part of the extensionist aspiration depends on assimilating more beings into the fold, some have taken up this strategy, like the Non-Human Rights Project, but they're not alone, to move beyond the human species boundary to combat what is sometimes called speciesism, what is sometimes called human normativity, what's sometimes called human exceptionalism. And one of the main strategies for expanding this circle is to turn to empirical work designed to show that those who have been excluded, like the other animals, are really similar to those at the center and thus deserving inclusion. If those on the margins of what's thought to matter, thought to be human, thought to be a person, can be shown through, let's say, ethological or cognitive research, for example, to have some of the qualities and capacities that we think is important to make us matter, then we ought to recognize and value those capacities in whatever bodies they arise, or so the argument goes. And many of the scientists who signed on to support the Non-Human Rights Project and many other experts identify the relevantly similar capacities that chimpanzees and other great apes, or sometimes whales, or sometimes elephants, and we can think about the animals that we think are smart, pigs, dogs. What they're trying to do, what the experts are trying to do, what those who work in cognitive ethology and comparative psychology are trying to do is show that they share with us these capacities, and therefore, in the case of the Non-Human Rights Project, that legal recognition should be granted to them in virtue of the fact that they have these capacities. So these are powerful analogies, and when they're appreciated, these sorts of claims challenge existing speciesist assumptions. They're also, I think, quite informative in their own right. Understanding what others may experience is a central component of our assessment of how our human activities may impact their well-being. So the project of rethinking personhood, to extend it beyond its current boundaries, relies on showing the ways that other animals can think and act like a human should. Notice, like a human should. To show that other animals do things that are very similar to the things that humans should do, and to possess a certain set of capacities that we think conform to and express human capacities. So the goal is to identify the canonical human and see if the capacities associated with that being, say, for example, these particular kinds of things like using tools or being conscious or solving problems or communicating or teaching or what have you, are capacities that are shared by other beings. Now, again, I have to do here's my friend Emma slide, so I have to tell you who she is. This is Emma. She was younger in this image, and it might look to you like what she's trying to do is open the hydraulic door so she and her friend Harper could maybe get out. She's checking the wrench to see whether or not she has the right size, and she's going to put the wrench on the hydraulic door sort of thing. She's a very smart and a marvelous chimpanzee, very, very, very clever, but she wasn't actually, she was just imitating what she saw the guy fixing the hydraulic system was doing at the time. She's actually someone who actually does get out of her enclosure, so it's not unusual to see her doing things that are related to that kind of activity. But anyway, back to the story. The goal for this kind of comparative or analogical work is to see whether or not there are certain capacities that chimpanzees have that will make them part of, or the capacities that fold into what it is that we as humans think are important. Now, I want to just say briefly a couple of things that are problematic about this kind of research, and I know some of you might have read something I've written about this, so I'm going to just be brief here. But in order to figure that out, in order to find out whether these other animals have these capacities, what we have to do is engage in certain kind of experimental protocols that are, in many ways, alter them, and that's the best case scenario, it just alters them. But in the worst case scenario, it can actually cause their suffering. So, for example, experiments to determine whether other animals have self-consciousness or recognize themselves in the mirrors, which is a very common way of trying to figure out whether they have certain capacities that are important for us. We have to figure out what's happening in their brains, and often that involves, at a minimum, anesthesia that can be dangerous and certainly is always disorienting. If we're doing more cognitive behavioral research, by the way, those kinds of invasive research on chimpanzees is no longer funded anywhere in the world. So if we want to talk about that in the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about that. But what it does still happen is the cognitive and behavioral research. And what's going on here is often also distorting. And so one of the things that happens in the case of Emma, maybe less so, but in other cases more so, is that these chimpanzees are raised in what gets called enculturated environments, which means that they're raised as humans by humans. And what that means is that they lose a lot of the capacity to interact with other chimpanzees. And one of the things that's really important for chimpanzee well-being in particular is their ability to socialize with one another. And if they lose the capacity to socialize, this is a particular kind of harm. Okay, so one of the other things I want to just highlight is that when this work is done to understand what the chimpanzees might be thinking or feeling, or to better understand what their worlds look like to them, which it often is, we're also basing that a lot on our own human assumptions. We think about them in terms of us. And so when we focus on how much they're like us, we end up assimilating them into our own anthropocentric framework. And we grant them the consideration that we do in virtue of what we believe they share with us, and rather ignore what makes their lives meaningful and valuable to them by their own lights. So when we're focused on the similarities, I worry that we're likely to miss important differences. So there's a really important example of this in theory of mind research. Just want to mention it briefly. It used to be the case that when we tried to figure out whether or not other chimpanzees have the capacity to attribute thoughts to others, which is what the simple way of putting theory of mind, the initial set of examples involved asking the chimpanzees to beg for food from two human beings. Perhaps one would have a blindfold and the other wouldn't have a blindfold, and the chimpanzees would just randomly beg. Or perhaps one would have a bucket over her head and the other would not have a bucket over her head, and the chimpanzees would randomly beg. And so the thought was, well, they clearly don't think that the people who are standing there have any capacities or thoughts, because they're just randomly begging. Why would you beg from someone who can't see you? And so the idea was, well, they clearly don't know. But it turns out when we stopped thinking of them in that way and started doing something that was a little bit more ethologically appropriate for them, they don't beg from each other, they steal food from one another. So when we started to look on whether or not a submissive would take food from a dominant chimpanzee, if the dominant chimpanzee couldn't see her, we found, oh, that's when she will steal the food from the dominant. So noting that difference between sort of assuming like our way of thinking, because we often as infants and children beg for food, or even as maybe adults who don't have food, we beg for food rather than stealing food. When we notice that chimpanzees aren't just hairier versions of us, we see that there's actually more going on. I just want to use one other example. This is This is an example from Peter Singer, where he says essentially that chimpanzees are comparable to 3-year-old humans in their capacity for self-awareness, for problem solving, and in the richness and complexity of their emotional lives. This is precisely the problem, I think, that goes into this approach. Because what I have, the pictures that you see here are that chimpanzee, I'm trying to stay at the microphone, that chimpanzee who's also hanging here, in case you can't see her, she's 3 years old. The chimpanzee in the higher branch of the tree is 8 years old. 3-year-old chimpanzees, 8-year-old chimpanzees, and 45-year-old chimpanzees are very, very different in their cognitive complexity. You might think, duh, but this is one of the problems of having a human model for thinking about cognition, and I just wanted to give you that example. So in trying to improve the law, so back to this notion, trying to improve the law by taking the human standard as a given and then working to expand it, we need to be particularly cautious that we don't construct and then ignore the capacities of others. Some humans and many non-humans who strive to construct meaningful ways of being in the world, but are differently abled, and by that I don't necessarily mean disabled, such that they aren't seen as similar to those who occupy a human center, need to be rethought. Indeed, historically, this othering has been a necessary part of the legal framework around personhood. In The Law is a White Dog, scholar Colin Diane explores another danger with this approach. She argues that the idea of legal personhood itself is required to produce racial domination. Not simply things and not really humans, she writes, slaves occupy a curiously nuanced category. Examples ranging from proofs of animality to marks of reason or imbecility, and a great deal in between, become part and parcel of the judicial work. Diane discusses a legal case, Bailey versus Poindexter, in which a slave owner, John Lewis Poindexter, writes in his will that his slaves should be allowed to choose to be emancipated or be sold publicly after he and his wife die. So the choice is, should they be free or should they be sold, and that's their choice. The heirs of the estate argued that slaves are property and therefore could not consent. But of course, Mr. Poindexter believed otherwise, and that undoubtedly came from observations and interactions, as the lawyer for the heirs argued, that Poindexter was playing God, as if he could create a new species, the lawyer notes. The lawyer says, he continues, common observation teaches that our slaves, in some cases, have a very high degree of intellect and moral sense and a strong enough will of their own. But, he went on, as property, slaves are civilly dead, like, quote, dogs, cattle, and wild animals, end quote. Civil death is to be dead or invisible to the law. Slaves, dogs, cattle, wild animals are all alive, but are not recognized as persons under the law. But slaves, dogs, cattle, and other animals are not just civilly dead. They're categorized as non-human. That is, they're socially dead. Orlando Patterson linked social death to slavery and defined the latter as a permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. There have been many discussions and debates about this definition since the publication of Slavery and Social Death in the 1980s. But for now, I want to highlight his 3 features of slavery. A, being experientially deprived of relationality. B, natally alienated, and which means the systematic rupture of familial continuity. And C, exposure to the threat or actuality of gratuitous violence. I'm going to say that again. There's these 3 features. 1 is being deprived of relationality. 2 is natal alienation, that is the rupture of the family continuities. We could say also cultural continuities. And C, exposure to the threat or actuality of gratuitous violence. Scholar Saidiya Hartman adds that the slave is, quote, a captured, owned, traded object of another. A number of scholars have suggested that slavery lives on in the social death that continues to be experienced by Black people in all the various forms captured by anti-Black racism. I hope you can see this. Calvin Warren is one of these scholars, and he puts it well in the context of thinking of the afterlife of slavery as it affects Black people. Kept alive but in a state of injury, in a phantom-like world of horrors and intense cruelty and profanity, the state of injury runs much deeper than physical abuse, torture, and violation. It's an ontological violence. This form of violence situates Blacks outside the traditional terms of humanism and into the realm we might describe as the ontological state of exception. Neither biopolitics nor necropolitics covers this Black being in the exception, because both discourses presume a human being upon which politics exercises power. Indeed, we might suggest that Blacks are placed in the netherworld of conceptual chaos that marks the limits of politics, both bio and necro. The experience of social death is not reducible to an experience of exclusion from the law or civil death. It's based on the logic, one that I've been developing by calling it a carceral logic, that serves as a conceptual mechanism that fixes or solidifies and maintains these exclusions and occlusions. In other words, it permanently marks an other as other. This sort of carceral logic is especially obvious in the case of our prisons, but anti-Black racism is itself embedded in this logic, and so, I want to suggest, is speciesism, by which I mean not discrimination against animals or the exclusion that the Non-Human Rights Project seeks to address, but something more basically anti-animal. For example, while we may observe equal vulnerability and systems of abuse within the carceral spaces of prisons and laboratories, the susceptibility to being incarcerated in the first place, or what we might think of as the open vulnerability, is an ontological feature of the status of the non-human. This is particularly germane when we consider the structural anti-Black racism that is a constituent part of US society. So here's a poignant, I think, reflection from one of my incarcerated students in relation to, we were talking about W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, and here's what my student James Davis writes about that. It's from his final paper. The prisoner is socially stigmatized, but as a Black man, he is conscious of the stigma of being a prisoner before ever becoming one. He has been imprisoned by the perception of his Black skin that he glimpses through the veil. Du Bois talks about the veil. Once in prison, the prisoner must contend with the conceptions that are intended to define him as other than who he is. Separated from equality and recognition, not once but twice, the Black prisoner is held captive by the numerous conflicts and contradictions that play an integral role in his conception of himself. Convicted of a crime, he must grapple with his criminality, but being perceived as a criminal was his reality before committing any criminal act. He was born guilty of possessing Black skin and was later convicted of being a Black man. End of his quote. So carceral logics are at the root of an ongoing disavowal of the experiences and meaning of the lives of so many. Disavowal is a willful and culpable ignorance, as James Baldwin describes it. White Americans' disavowal is not just a refusal to recognize Black Americans as human, but a failure to acknowledge the necessity of anti-Blackness for the existence of whiteness. Anti-Blackness is the condition of agency or subjectivity for white domination, or magnanimous acts of alleged inclusion. As Frank Wilderson III argues, quote, white human capacity in advance of the event of discrimination or oppression is parasitic on Black incapacity. And he writes, without the Negro, capacity itself is incoherent. His musings on incapacity is particularly instructive when we think about the strategy of trying to extend inclusion in the sphere of the human by identifying the capacities that are shared with others. If the ontological structure of whiteness is predicated upon the necessary incapacity of blackness, there can be no inclusion, and it's questionable whether animals can be seen as possessing capacities, the denial of which maintains the boundary between the human and the non. This ontological analysis helps us to interpret, I hope, the cases of Marius the Giraffe and Samuel Debose, with which I began. Sacrificing the lives of animals in the name of conserving a diverse gene pool is commonplace in zoos. Zoothanasia, as it's called by its critics, usually by means less grotesque than a shotgun to the head, is actually really quite normalized practice, particularly in European zoos. The animals are seen as disposable specimens, and that is determined by those who capture, own, and trade them. Remember what Saidiya Hartman says. They aren't commodities in the traditional sense of things that are traded on markets, although they're fungible and accumulated. They share these markings with the slave. The specimenification, I made up that word, I hate that word. If anybody has a better word, please let me know what it is. Specimenification, the making of beings into specimens. That's too many words. So specimenification, not a great word. Anyway, specimenification helped create and has continued to reinforce the afterlife of scientific racism, eugenic ideologies, and the continued exploitation of things deemed other. Zoo captives are disposable specimens par excellence. Perhaps interesting ones, perhaps beautiful ones, perhaps entertaining ones, but disposable all the same. Black bodies, too, in cars, on streets, in parks, and in prisons, are disposable. The public killing of Marius, although it wasn't in the United States, is one of the tools used to inure a public to assassinations of disposable beings and reinforcing this idea of carceral logic. When there's a reinforcing logic of disposability operating, it isn't just domination, oppression, or exclusion that's at stake, although it's that too, but a deeper logic, if you will, that authorizes the ontological violence and killing. That's the logic that's built into the category of the human. As Claire Kim has recently written in an article entitled Murder and Mattering in Harambe's House, and she's referring there both to Harambe, the gorilla who was killed again in Cincinnati. Does anybody know about that case? Yes. But also an older sense of Harambe. The black is the very antithesis of a human subject, the counterpoint against which the human could gain coherence and knowledge of self. We could say then that the human is paradigmatically both not animal and not black, birthed through the simultaneous application of these two sorry, I'm not saying that word right, requiring the presence of both the animal and the black to locate itself. The human ejects itself from the superset category of animal and ejects from within itself the subset category of black, opening a zone of thriving marked by these external and internal limits. Blackness and animalness then form poles in a closed loop of meaning. Blackness is a species construct, meaning in proximity to the animal, and animalness is a racial construct, meaning in proximity to the black, and the two are dynamically interconstituting all the way down. In this sense, the anti-black social order that props up the human is also a zoological order, or what we might call a zoologo-racial order. Recently, Silk Ho, reflecting on Sylvia Wynter's 1992 No Humans Involved open letter written after the police were acquitted in the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles, admits that she used to be the kind of black activist who claimed, we're human too, but now she questions that strategy. And just as an aside, because I know 1992 was a really long time ago, the No Humans Involved was the idea that what the police, NHI, the police in Los Angeles used NHI to refer to a crime scene in which black people were involved. So no humans involved. And this is back now to Silko. In both the narrative of speciesism and the narrative of racism, the members of the losing side both fall short of real human status, and as a result, their suffering and their deaths are mundane, normal, and expected. In my view of things, Sill's view of things, the humanity trumped up in one narrative is the same humanity trumped up in the other. If we want to make a connection, this is the connection we should be making. The connection we make is not found in the oppressions themselves or the oppressed bodies, but we need to make salient the human in both cases. Human means a certain way of being, especially exemplified by how one looks or behaves, what practices are associated with one's community, and so on. So the human and what humanity is just a conceptual way to mark the provenance of European whiteness as the ideal way of being Homo sapiens. This means that the conceptions of humanity and human and animality and animal have been constructed along racial lines. So, if we're interested in dismantling the carceral logic that authorizes the disposable status of Black people and animals, we need to not ask who's human now, but rather to jettison the category of the human itself. I confess I don't quite know how this will go, but I'm hoping we can talk about it. And I think we can't get there unless we start imagining new ways of building relationships, new ways of meaning making, and creating new ways of living together. Thank you.
Would you like to field your own questions, or would you like me to call on people for you?
You should call on people for me.
Okay.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. And so.
Because you're going to know people, probably.
Well, only a quarter of these are my students, so I might know them, I might not.
Okay.
But, so we usually start with questions from students. So does anyone have any questions at this point that they would like to ask Mr. Gruen?
So I took a mythology class last semester, which is very interesting, and it got me thinking about how we kind of seem to define ourselves through stories about our special connection with God or our dominion over the earth or something like that. And that always comes down to like, there's a separation between humans and the rest of creation. And I wonder if by trying to eliminate the term human, how that would necessarily, you have to rewrite those stories about our special relationship with divineness.
Divineness, yeah. So, okay, so that's a great question. I mean, that's what I'm saying. This is a really radical idea, get rid of the human altogether. But I think that it's important to make sort of a clarification. So I'm not saying the word human, it's the concept of the human that I'm interested in getting rid of. And the concept itself means various things to various people. Right, the word itself means various things to various people anyway. So I think one of the things that I've talked a lot about to a particular student of mine who's incarcerated is the way, in reference to the divine, in the way that Jesus is white, even in Black churches or some Black churches. And there's this question about how is that, what is being conveyed in that. So the very notion of connection with, the Savior or the divine or what have you already diminishes the non-white believer or something like that. So I think even in those cases, I think it's important to think differently about how anti-Black racism and racism of various forms gets replicated even in those relations of the human to the divine. And that's part of what I'm getting at. The human is always going to be understood in a very specific way, and I'm suggesting the human is always not just non-human, meaning other animals, but also white. and this is a small group of scholars who I have been indebted to, who are also trying to think through these things together. Yeah. Hello.
So human has always been a very useful kind of shortcut or proxy for people who are deserving of rights and protections. So if you want to eliminate the concept, how then do we determine what beings are deserving of rights and protections?
Right. I mean, that is the first strategy that I was talking about, right? So it is what we think about as human is a placeholder for worthy, right? And so the strategies have always been, let's try to include more into the category of the worthy, rather than to notice that the category requires exclusions. And so what I'm suggesting is that when we notice that the category requires exclusions, it doesn't exist without its non-worthy, right? The worthy and the non-worthy, that's what the basis of that category is. Once we start to notice that, then we might be able, again, I don't really know how to do this. I want you to think with me about how to do this. But the idea is, perhaps we can think, instead of thinking about capacity and incapacity, instead of thinking about some who have power and authority to grant status, we start to think differently about how to make meaningful, worthy relationships amongst ourselves and amongst others that aren't with us, and think that, oh, you know, what giraffes do, let's just let the giraffes do what the giraffes do. Let's not try to figure out whether they have certain capacities that make them worthy or not worthy. That's the idea. But you want to follow up.
I do want to follow up. But the problem, of course, is that people don't always form worthy relationships, and so part of the purpose of society is to impose certain minimum standards, like you're not allowed to go around slapping people. So how can we have a system that can be consistently applied to all kinds of relationships without necessarily creating the category of worthiness all over again?
Right, so I think you're onto something here. So we might think that we want to develop a system of allowing for the worthiness of we're not going to look to the law, we're not going to look to the state to develop who's worthy, who's not worthy. But we might look to the law to help when our relationships with one another break down, which would just be a different way of understanding what the law's purpose is. So what you heard when Steve Weiss was here was a way of recognizing that the law divides beings into persons and property. And what he's thinking is, okay, let's move some of the things that are in property status into person status. Another way you might go is, let's not have the law make those divisions, or let's create 5 or 10 divisions, or do you get what I'm thinking? So I'm just trying to think through the limitations of the system, not just the legal system, but the conceptual system that we're and the ontological system that we're currently operating under. Now, Frank Wilderson, who I cited earlier, I mean, his view is that in order to really disrupt the fundamental structures of anti-Black racism, we have to, as he puts it, end the world, by which he means really undo all of these systems that have been in place, not end the world in the sense of like, boom. So I think that's part of, I think, a really interesting project, a really interesting justice project. Wow, this is...
Okay, I'll jump in. I have a kind of half-formed thought. At the very end of your talk, I actually flashed back to our first speaker in September, Priscilla Wald, who's a literary critic and or a literary scholar, and most of you probably weren't there, but there's a little bit of a parallel in what you were talking about and unfortunately, I only remember part of this, so maybe the other Sidore people can help me. But she was actually questioning, so talking about, not talking about non-human animals, talking about human society and sort of mass traumas like slavery, genocide, stuff like that. And she was actually questioning species identification on the human level. That is not the solution to racism, for example. And then I kind of forget the second part of that. So I'll just throw that out there. You know, I guess to try to make it into a question. So do you see a similarity in, like, say, you know, if we want to heal the traumas that we as people, you know, that are in our collective memory and our living memory, should we stop trying to fix racism? I guess I'm kind of, you know, or should we get rid of the idea of race as the human race, that we're all one race?
Okay, so I think that would be only possible if there were many sort of intervening steps that occurred. So there's this, everybody's familiar with the idea that, or at least a few years ago, we were post-racial. That's really dangerous, right? Because the structures of racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, you know, are still really alive and well. And so there's a sense in which we don't want to jump to being post-racial. And there's when we think about, okay, let's get rid of race, that's a place to move. But the idea of, I mean, if you think about species itself, the concept of species is also what I would call a normative concept. It's a concept that's invoked for particular purposes and particular practices. And certainly race is also normative in those ways. And so I think very fundamentally, rethinking sort of our tendencies to think biologically about race, to think biologically about species, to think biologically about the human.
That's where she was
Yes,
going with it.
yes.
It wasn't post-racial.
Right, right. So those are the exact, we're on the same. So to stop thinking biologically about these categories, or if we are thinking biologically about them, in the case of species, there is a biological component, but what a species is largely going to depend on what biological questions you want answered. So there's this really interesting philosophy of science research that people might know about. And there's 26 different species concepts. It really largely depends on who's doing what kind of thing. What we're taught in high school biology, that what a species is two beings are able to mate. That doesn't really help when you have really all different species because of changes in what you're interested in. The questions you're interested in asking are what define a species for a scientist who's engaged in that practice. That's what I call normative, which means there's a value ladenness. It's not reducible to some sort of observable biological difference. And I think the same thing is true of the human itself. We need to stop thinking of the human as a biological category, as you've been talking about all along, and think about the human as a political, I'm arguing, a political category. And when we think of it as a political category, we see that, whoa, if it's a political category, it's really a problematic political category, as I hope I've hinted at.
So, you may remember this, but a while ago there was a kind of a movement in ecology and feminism, maybe we could call it ecofeminism.
Mm-hmm.
And there, the closeness, I was just thinking about the closeness of Blackness and animalness and how that obviously has a negative valence, as it were. But in ecofeminism, the fact that women were called animalistic names, identified as animals in a way, was a strength, as it were, in ecofeminism. In other words, we were aligned with nature. We were considered to be sort of animalistic, natural, in contradistinction to some ideal. But there was kind of a reevaluation of all values. I mean, there was kind of So feminists didn't take that as a negative, as it were. That is to say, ecofeminists took that as, so we're natural, we're close to nature, we're not on the culture, reason, university side of things, but we're kind of in the natural world. And that was a positive, so the animalism, the naturalism, and all that stuff. And I'm just interested, thinking back on that, how this pairing, this way of systematizing animalistic being and blackness, though it's uncomfortable thought, doesn't have that, I mean, in other words, that's not seen as a strength, as it were, whereas in ecofeminism, there was no question but that people thought that somehow women would be better at enslaving the planet, and I'm really, obviously that's not, that's a very reduced thought. Right. But basically that if you were more in tune with nature and sort of the animal world and such, that was actually a sense that you could do something, know something, and understand something, whereas here, this identification is, well, of course, not true or literal. What it means metaphorically is not some kind of insight, some kind of, it means not having the status of a human being.
Right. So
I don't know whether you remember back.
I totally do, because I work, I mean, yes. So, yes, exactly. But what I want to do is, so that was the first impulse. I mean, so it's actually really interesting that you raise this, because the first impulse was to recognize that there is this way, and it was, Sherry Ortner did the, is woman to nature, is man to culture as woman to nature. I'm botching it, but that's something, right? So the idea initially was, wait a minute, we see women as being reduced. It was reduced to this lower status, closer to nature. But the important thing there was, that led to a wide blossoming of theorizing about what that would look like and what that could mean. And one of the things that it led to is, kind of important standpoint epistemological notions that because women were in a particular way of, women were understood to be in a particular kind of relationship or set of relationships, that they had better insight, better understanding of those, of nature or of other animals on the one hand. But it also, and this is the important thing that pulls us in here, it also then led to questions about the very nature of these binaries. And so with Val Plumwood's work and others, the very notion of what we used to call value dualisms, right? Or another way of thinking about these binaries, where there's one side of the binary and that's valued and worthy, to go back to the earlier point, and another side of the binary that necessarily is unworthy. That's what's going on. So that same logic of the ecofeminist logic is operating here. So it's not to glorify, on the one hand, the animal, the status of the animal or the status of black, but it's to suggest that there's a construction of a binary that necessitates that both the animal and blackness be othered. And that should challenge our very conception of the human. So in much the same way that, for example, Donna Haraway's noted that we have nature cultures. We don't have nature and culture. That binary gets brought together. But that's a great point. Do you want to ask about chimpanzees? I'd love to talk about chimpanzees. It's a little easier to ask questions about chimpanzees.
What do we need to know about chimpanzees that we don't know? Given that I don't know anything.
About chimpanzees, yeah. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
My friend knows something over here.
So, with chimpanzees, and even with Steve Weiss's work talking about chimpanzees in captivity, he estimates 2,500 in captivity, not in chimpanzee, but not in
Right. It's more like 22, but 2,200. But yes.
several thousand.
2,000.
The larger scale problem, for example, one of my questions for you, when you raise this issue about many chimps, including some of the chimps at Chimp Haven, are more or less acclimated to being around other chimpanzees and better able to live in a sanctuary setting than others. you, as a best practice for how do we handle this problem with chimpanzees that may not be
Yeah.
able to be woven into a chimpanzee kind.
Right. That's a great question. So there are a number of chimpanzees that have been in a few research laboratories, and fortunately, most of those chimpanzees are socialized to some extent, because early on it became clear that keeping chimpanzees housed in isolation was not good for anybody. So the laboratory chimpanzees are a lot easier to introduce to one another. Some of them are a little, some of the activists like Steve Wise and some of the people he works with think they have post-traumatic stress disorder. I have a concern about that diagnoses, but they certainly have, some trauma, to go back, that they've experienced, and so it requires a certain kind of slow adjustment, but they're socialized in such a way that they can live together. Like the saddest thing that I see of those animals is some of them are what we call wall walkers, so they're only used to being on cement, so that it takes them a really, really long time to feel comfortable on grass. They just want to be near cement, so that sort of thing. But they're at least, they have social skills. Maybe they're little truncated social skills, but they're social skills. The really sad cases are the cases that Steve Wise is trying to work on, and those are cases of animals that have lived in chimpanzees that have lived in isolation, and they don't know anything about how to be chimpanzees. I know a couple of those chimps too. They don't like chimpanzees. They don't want to live with chimpanzees. And there's a sanctuary, a smaller sanctuary in Florida, the Center for Great Apes, that does amazing work allowing these chimps to live in close proximity, but they don't interact directly, so for their protection. And we talked a little bit earlier, chimpanzees, they may seem really neat, and I certainly adore them, but they're really, they're extraordinarily strong, dangerous wild animals. They're not, you don't want to let angry, unsocialized chimpanzee who doesn't like other chimpanzees in with another chimpanzees, because you will see there will be a lot of violence. So that's one way that some of the smaller sanctuaries are addressing that. A worry that I have is that because I just said they're dangerous wild animals, there is a general set of skills that needs to be used to introduce chimpanzees to one another, and there are not that many people who have those skills. And so that's one of the worries as well. So the introductions often take too long, which can be a problem. Sometimes they're done in a haphazard way. That's not a good idea either. But I do think there's possibilities for some, especially one of the things I found amazing at Chimp Haven, for example, is that chimpanzees who were wild caught but lived in laboratories for a long time still retain some of their knowledge of wild behaviors and can teach other chimpanzees those wild behaviors. So the chimps you saw in the trees, there, sorry. That's Valentina Rose, and that's Tracy. These guys just learned that from their mother. Actually, Tracy learned it from her mother, and then Tracy taught it to the other. So the idea, this isn't a natural behavior if you grow up in captivity, but they can remember that. So I do think that there's a potential for more integration. But again, I think that the ones that are at roadside zoos or in backyards or in that or entertainment. The Center for Great Apes actually has a number of chimpanzees that were used in entertainment and been pretty successful in getting some of them reintegrated, including, not Mr. Jiggs, but including Bubbles, who was Michael Jackson's chimp, is living in Florida. Any more chimp questions? Okay, you can ask a question.
I don't know how to put this. So it sounds like your project is a little bit like Charlotte's in that, Professor Witt, your goal was, do you think the norms of gender are destructive? Go ahead. Tell me if I'm wrong. Just tell me if I'm getting warmer or colder. But you think the norms of gender are destructive? And
I think gender norms, this is just so obvious, I think gender norms are involved in gender justice. So I think it's not just a legal thing, I think it's a whole social normativity
we'd be better off without gender? You're a gender abolitionist. Warmer or colder? No?
I mean, I think it'd be fine to get rid of gender, but I'm not committed to it.
Okay. Because I was thinking that if your project was that gender norms are pernicious.
She wants to get rid of
Human.
Get rid of
We
human.
work together.
I know, I'm thinking about it.
Saying, you know,
Humans, and then you take care of my problem.
I know, I'll just.
the thing is, so I'm not super optimistic that we'll get rid of the norms of gender. I think we can.
No, I want to get rid of patriarchy.
Well, I think that they're, yeah.
Okay, who wants to get rid of patriarchy?
Right, so if you want to get rid of patriarchy, but you think they're connected with the specific norms of gender that we have.
Well, yeah.
I think I might be more extreme than you, because I think that it might be hard to get rid of patriarchy without getting rid of gender.
It's the same thing.
But I'm not
That's a
optimistic.
logical possibility for me to do that. So,
I think it would be very challenging to do that, given the way our culture, the way all cultures that we know of are
okay,
set
let's
up.
go back to
And
the
then so I was thinking, like, it sounds like you want to get rid of the human, because you think this concept of the human is like,
normative in that way.
it's the
That is-
jewel in the crown of worthiness.
Exactly right.
And as long as there's that jewel in the crown of worthiness, all the other creatures along the crown are going to be less important, and we'll come up with reasons to devalue them.
They'll not just be less important, but their worth will be measured in that way.
They'll be measured,
So
right.
that's going to be the scale.
And it's important. I mean, and that's exactly right. So it's not just that they're less important, but that their unworthiness is necessary for the worthiness of the human.
Okay,
Right.
That's another step.
that's another step. I don't know about that. I have to think about that. So,
I mean, that's how the concept, what I'm suggesting is that's how the concept's
so you're
been.
saying the human is kind of like patriarchy, in the sense that as long as we have this norm of the human,
Yeah.
there'll be oppression for everybody else.
Well, yeah, so the part that I kept sort of suggesting is there's oppression, yes, but it's not just oppression. There's domination, yes, it's not just domination, but it's actually, that's the part that it's ontological, it's necessary. So, I mean, what patriarchy does, I mean, you could correct me if I, like this, what patriarchy does is really set up a set of standards that others can't meet, right? It's not an inclusive category. You might think that the human is an inclusive category, and all we need to do is figure out the way we include others. But what I'm arguing is it's not an inclusive category, in much the way that patriarchy is not inclusive. It doesn't allow itself to include because it's created by exclusion. As soon as once you start asking to include the exclusion, you're destroying the category of the human.
Okay.
So that's the idea.
All right, so
I thought you meant that something like Steve Wise's project is in a way reinforcing something that should not be reinforced.
Well,
So if you say, I want chimps included, and there's no reason for you not to include chimps, you are playing the game of the exclusion vote.
Right.
As a-
Right, and there's multiple ways in which the exclusion operates, and that's one of them.
But he's just doing that as a legal strategy. That isn't his philosophical view is not that only chimps, dolphins, and elephants matter. It's just that he thinks that they're sufficiently like humans that we could loop them into our legal protections.
Right. And I think there's a really interesting question about how much you can use this exclusionary system without ultimately reinforcing that system, right? So let's suppose we end up with a system, an exclusionary system that includes, let's say, let's just use animals. The non-human animals. That includes the dolphins, the chimpanzees, the elephants, the whales. It's going. Well, the problem with the octopus is it's not going to actually. That's a really good example. That's a really, really good. Okay, it's a really good example because they have their neural networks or their nervous systems are fundamentally different from the human. And if we did include them, that might be good because that would undo the human in a big way. Yeah, so that could be like a subversive strategy of including the octopus, but and then it really messes the category.
Suppose we did that, you were finishing a thought though. Suppose we included those
Oh, right. So if we include some, then we are actually, it is reinforcing. We're reinforcing because then again, what we're saying is, okay, there's these particular capacities that are necessary. And again, this gets back to the incapacity that some Black scholars are arguing is necessary. So when you have a capacity that's worthy, you have an incapacity that's necessary to recognize the worthiness of the capacity. So there's going to always be some incapacity, and what we know from the U.S., I mean, I'm just going to speak of the U.S., but we know that incapacity has a particular set of meanings through the institution of slavery.
So if you propose getting rid of the concept of humans, I found in my life that the structure of my life is based around instructions that I get from other people that are based on the category that I'm in. So say, you're a young man, these are the things that you should do as a young man. Or you're a good person, you should be a steward of the earth, you should be kind. So there's all those positive things that comes with these categories.
Right.
There's a lot of negative things, but how would you have those positives if you got rid of the whole thing?
I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion. I have a book called Entangled Empathy, and in the book I argue that some of our traditional ethical frameworks for thinking about other non-human animals, I'll just call them, sort of don't capture a variety of things. I'll just make this, I'm not going to go off on all that thing. But the idea is that what's really important ultimately in figuring out who we are is a recognition, this goes back to philosopher Karen Barad, that we're fundamentally entangled, that we're not just influenced, but we're co-constituted by the various relationships that we're in, both near and far, and that a lot of those relationships that we're in, she argues, are with matter and other kinds of things, but that I argue that the relationships that we're in with other animals can also be self-constituting. I mean, they constitute who we are. And so in my own case, Emma, the chimpanzee that I was showing you who was maybe opening the hydraulics, you know, when I started interacting with her, it really started to change my philosophical outlook. And it wasn't something I planned on doing. And so it was really something that I learned from her. And I think the same kind of thing can happen in a variety of ways. When Brian Stevenson, you know Brian Stevenson? Yeah. So he argues it's really important that to get proximity to difference. And that when we get proximity to difference, we really are changed. And that is very much the part of entanglement that I find really compelling, both practically and philosophically. So it's not just the norms of what a good young man does, but to sort of open ourselves to a variety of different relations, and that in those relations we can also be instructed, as it were. That's what you're talking about, instructed. And so we can do that across difference too, and we needn't use humanity or human as the framework that helps us to grow up or grow differently. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just to build on this last point that you made, are you saying that maybe we should almost flip it? So, you know, like women, Native Americans, Africans, African Americans have been associated in a negative way with the natural or what have you, and
The non-human.
that's what we should all do.
Right. I think, yeah. Why? I mean, what would it look like?
So instead of saying like, you know, it's like a huge thing, so you critique the racism and all the, you know, the oppression in that, but then you also say, and maybe we can all learn from sort of embracing those connections with nature, or something that's been denigrated before maybe shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's partly what would have to happen if we were to start to think that the category of the human doesn't guide us. It doesn't structure us. And then, sure, then that would mean all sorts of things. Now, there's a really great and wonderfully robust literature developing on, I mean, there's all sorts of different names for it, but sort of thinking of it just as like sort of mattering, right? And so how we become different when we are engaged in, I mean, octopus are a good example here, but also, different, what Jakob van Uxkel called umwelts, right? Different worlds. And he gives us a story of the tick. I mean, I really don't like ticks. I don't know about you guys, but I really don't like ticks. I want to create a new ontology where everything is worthy except ticks. No, don't. Just kidding. But the idea is, so we get these senses of what the world is like for these other beings, other creatures, and what can we learn from that? Not through our human necessary. I mean, there's a sense in which we're always inevitably anthropocentric. We look at the world through our own eyes. We don't look at the world through other eyes. And I think there's really exciting work on perception that can help us to think about ways of both acknowledging the inevitability of our anthropocentric gaze, but also ways in which we can possibly imagine seeing differently. And I would think that would be a really useful way of doing it. What we could learn, how we could change our relationships, how we can change our social interactions, how we make meaningful lives, all of that I think can be really interestingly done by sort of questioning and problematizing the centrality and what you were saying, that like crown jewel of the human, dethroning the human.
So I have one more question unless somebody else has something. So this is just a thought that I was having, which is that, so one of the things that the category of the human does for us is it sort of acts as a signpost, morally speaking, so that we know how to respond to the value in other humans, and then translate some of that response to other sentient beings as well. So it acts as a guide for us. Now, it sounds like lots of moral philosophy is built on this idea of moral principles oriented around the rational agent. Now, once you get rid of the human as the marker of the rational agent, then it seems like you're kind of falling into a radical particularism where you try to empathize with every individual that you encounter and respond to its value. And so one thought is this: the value that an ant has is not the same. The value that a tick has is not the same as the value that a human has, even a very cognitively disabled human. And it's even less than my chickens. So in other words, there are different kinds of value, and the human gives us a signpost for sorting them out so we know how to respond. I was watching a discussion between a Ramneda epistemologist and an ant specialist, and they were talking about whether ants can reason and how they feel about killing ants. And the ant specialist said, when I only see one ant, I feel really bad about killing it. When I see the whole colony, it doesn't bother me at all. So he said the way he engages with the ants changes the way he responds to them, but he doesn't think they have that. He thinks they're awesome. He's an ant, he's an ant specialist. But he does not think that they have the same value that the human does. And so what kind of signpost do we have for getting rid of the human? It seems like it starts with the human and goes down.
So I have this experiment that I use for my students, so I'll share it with you all. Maybe you can talk about it in class. But and it's just, it's one of these contrived philosophy thought experiments. So if you imagine yourself on a lifeboat, and with you on your lifeboat is your best friend who's a dog, and a child who, let's say, is cognitively disabled and isn't going to ever be repaired. I know. And there's also a performing orangutan who was used in circuses. And so it does seem like one of the reason I'm raising this is that it seems that there's a sense in which the human can sometimes help us. What I've been trying to highlight today is that the human actually has been a category that has excluded people, persons, consistently and historically, and that's a problem. It's also a category that requires the exclusion of these others. So it may have helped guide us in ways maybe when we were a little less kind of thoughtful. But we were thoughtful, and we could think about these things, and we could see. My students often answer in really different ways. Some of them will save the dogs, some of them will save the humans, some of them will save the great apes, some of them won't. So I think that I'm just trying to get us to challenge that. It looks like people need to go.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.